Thank you for coming. Thank you to Malaprops for hosting this as well. So thank you all. I'm so excited.
Yeah, me too. I hope you all out there are even half as excited as we are to be here. Um, so I'm going to just launch right in, Matthew, and start asking you a few questions. One of the things I think of when I was putting your bio together, is that you have a very diverse work history. Do you have a specific previous job that you think feeds your writing the most, or that you pull up the most?
I would say that they all share the qualities of interpersonal relationships. And so I think that's what I draw on the most from all of these positions. So, I mean, I would say obviously being a professor is the greatest. It's what I'm doing now. I get to work with students every day, whether it's in the writing center or in class. And so that really feeds my creative soul and helps energize me.
That's awesome. I love that. And then, of course, we are also looking at a vast amount of places that appear in the book. For you all, there are just multiple locations that serve as settings for this book, and they range from Minnesota and Mississippi to California and various other places. And so you've lived in a lot of places, obviously, Matthew. Is there a landscape, a specific landscape or a location that feels especially ripe for story to you? And how do you choose the settings for your stories?
I would say in terms of a landscape that maybe energizes me the most, I think about living in Minnesota. When I was in Minneapolis, they called it something like the biggest small town in America or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very, on the one hand, very manageable. You got to know people, but on the other hand, it had the perks of the big city. And you could drive for half an hour, 45 minutes and be out in the country, which was great too. Living in North Carolina reminds me a lot of where I grew up in Maryland, in the foothills of the mountains. And so this place feels very familiar, very comfortable, but sometimes you have to be outside that comfort zone to find something really inspiring.
Absolutely. And so when you're putting a story together, does it is it often that setting comes first for you, or do you sort of impose setting later? And how do you know where the story belongs?
I start with character usually.
Okay.
And one of the things I find as I experiment with a character and try to explore their backstory, of course, is where they are. So setting isn't number one, but I did notice as I was putting the collection together that for these stories, setting is very important. And so I was trying to stick with that as one of the connecting threads for the collection.
That's wonderful. Yeah. As I've mentioned to you before, I love, there's a story that takes place on the beach in California, and the character is really sort of like she's at sea in many ways. And there is the ocean kind of, crashing against the shore and the tides pulling out, it's just right there with what's going on in the story. And I just love it. You do that so well.
Thank you.
Another one of my favorite settings and one of my favorite characters in this whole collection is this very curmudgeonly man in the story titled Good Intentions. And I'd love for you to read a little from the beginning of that story so that people can experience this great voice that you have created.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Great.
It's not a cult, he told himself. It's an intentional community. This had become his mantra during the 3-hour drive south to visit Cassidy, his daughter. She'd called that week for only the 3rd time since her wedding, and he'd been so glad to hear from her that he'd agreed to everything. Of course, I'll bring all of your old children's books, he'd told her. And even though 1/4 of the drive was unpaved, he'd be glad to make the trip on one of his rare free Saturdays to check all the children's teeth. and he wouldn't dream of expecting payment. With the trunk full of moldering books of Eric Carle, Beverly Cleary, and Roald Dahl, and a large tackle box of dental supplies rattling in the back seat, he and his wife, Cassidy's stepmother, bumped down the gravel road leading to the compound. "You're muttering," Pam said, "and they don't call it that." "That's what it is." "Cassie says it's an intentional community." That term again. What the hell did it even mean? Was this place really any more intentional than their neighborhood in St. Paul? They'd spent 5 weeks looking for the right spot, another 2 negotiating with the seller. Wasn't that intentional? But he knew better than to ask. Even Pam was on board with what she referred to as Cassidy's lifestyle. Pam's willingness to make the best of things irked him sometimes, the same way it bothered him that she called his daughter Cassie, which neither he nor Cassidy's late mother had. Even Pam's outfit, hiking boots, flannel-lined khakis, sweater, and windbreaker, she always dressed in layers, got on his nerves. While she had the perfect ensemble for every occasion, he'd scrutinized his third of their closet for 20 minutes, trying to determine what one wore on one's first visit to a cult. In the end, he gave up and stuck with the jeans and sweatshirt he'd had on in the first place. The road was washed out in spots, so he had to pull onto the scrub, risking the car's paint job and side mirror every time he dodged a hole and careened towards the trees. Branches snapped beneath the tires, reminding him of the time, only weeks after she'd gotten her license, when Cassidy had almost broken an axle on his Audi. Somehow, a 3-foot tree limb had gotten jammed in one of the front wheel wells, though she denied having anything to do with it. The trees, almost bare, flew by to either side while he looked straight ahead, studying the road's dips and inclines, the pools of rainwater and smatterings of leaves. "Slow down," Pam said. "I saw kids running around up ahead." Once he eased off the gas pedal enough that they weren't being thrown back and forth against their seatbelts, he too noticed a couple of little ones running in the field to the right. They had long sticks in their hands, the smallest boy straining to keep a dead tree limb upright like a jouster. "It's Lord of the Flies out here. They're having fun. Didn't you ever play in the woods? In the city, we played street hockey and tried not to get run down by Mrs. Applewhite's Buick." They came around a sharp bend and arrived in a clearing so abruptly that he had to use both feet on the brake to stop in time. They skidded to a halt in front of a semicircle of low buildings, all evenly spaced. A half-stripped minivan sat on blocks to the right, and various paths connected the huts, led off into the trees, and disappeared. People descended on them before he could take the key out of the ignition, kids pressing their dirty noses and dirtier hands to the window, their mothers unable to pull them back. Reinforcements trickled out of buildings that looked like the hooches he'd searched in Vietnam. "I feel like we're on a National Geographic expedition." "You promised you'd be on good behavior." "I'm purging myself of impure comments," he said.
I love that. I don't know about you all, but I definitely have family members whose voices I can hear in that character. Um, so over the course of the story, Matthew, you give him so much room to show off this like crusty exterior that he has, but you also give him a lot of room to kind of show his heart. As the story unfolds, he kind of his vulnerability opens up in a way that's so beautiful. How did this character come to be for you? How did he form?
Yeah, this is one of the ones that was a little more amorphous than others. I was trying to write a character who was as different from me as I could imagine, and just as a kind of a thought experiment. And I came up with this guy who had been a Vietnam vet. He's a dentist. And the one thing when I figured it out that really allowed me to latch on to him was his statement to himself late in the story that he's done everything right. He's done everything he was asked to do in life. So why has it ended up this way? And that's really what I was thinking about, is this guy who he's drafted. So he goes to Vietnam. He doesn't try to get out of the war. Then he comes home, he goes to dental school. He gets married and has a child, and all of these steps along the way. And thinking about, well, how does he end up where he ends up in this story? And is that really the end of the world that he thinks it is at the beginning?
Right. Yeah. His arrival at the cult.
Yeah.
I love it. Is it so with this character, he comes to a place of sort of like a personal resolution. Is that something that's important to you to have in your stories, to have the character have a resolution or revelation when you write them?
I think this is one of the rare cases where there is that degree of resolution for a character. In the earlier drafts of this story, I had a flash forward at the end, where in a paragraph or so of what was at the time too much fancy writing, I would say, I'd take him forward in his life and see, yes, everything's going to be all right. And his daughter's going to give birth to her child, and their life is going to go on. And then some journal editors insisted it's too pat, it's wrapping it up too much. So I backed it off a little bit and killed those darlings. But I still feel like this story does have a fair amount more resolution for the character. I usually tend to leave them a little more open-ended.
Yeah, I love his journey and just where I think it ends in such a beautiful place, even though it's not neatly tied. There's a story in the collection, the first story, that's titled "Enjoy Your Stay," and I want to talk about that one because it had this incredibly sort of ominous, eerie vibe to it as I read it, and especially after it ended, it's one of those stories I still think about, and I'm like, what exactly is going on with those folks? Was that your intent?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was trying to write an unsettling, troubling story. I get the one criticism I get from people is that my stories are too quiet. So I thought, well, I can make quiet menacing in this case.
Yes.
And make sure that people see that or people maybe enjoy being a little uncomfortable to a certain degree with the characters in this story and where they end up.
Yes. And it feels like it could easily turn into a full mystery novel. And I know we talked a little bit about that. Why don't you share?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of there's some mystery references. I think that story has a reference to I think it's called "Who Killed Roger Ackroyd" or something like that.
Right.
And before I wrote this story, I was a failed mystery writer. When I finished my MFA, I wrote 3 drafts of 3 different mystery novels, or detective novels mainly. And I always felt like I had strong plots, but I could never get the subplots and the twists and turns and all of that down. But I tried to use some of that and some of the research I'd done over the years for this particular story.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. As I was saying to Matthew, we chatted about this recently. I love that there was like this sort of palette cleansing sort of after the MFA to like delve into another realm of writing and feel free to explore that, which is great.
Absolutely. The stereotype of too many cooks in the kitchen, this is a great way to break away from that and to do something kind of private.
Yeah.
For a change.
Yes, I love that. And actually, I want to ask you a little bit, because you are writing in other forms, novels, short stories, and poetry. How do you move between those 3?
One of the reasons this collection took so long to come together, I mentioned on Twitter today, this is a 20-year process for this collection from the first story to today. And one of the reasons is that I tend to write stories in bursts, but they come infrequently. And so I'll work on a novel fairly diligently, and then all of a sudden this character comes to me who doesn't fit in the novel in any way. And so I might take a couple of weeks, a month, 6 weeks off from the novel and quickly write this story. And then of course another story comes. And so I write that one really quickly. And then hopefully I can get back to remembering what that novel was all about. But so that's really, it's a messy process. I don't set aside, say, an hour a day for novel writing and an hour a day for poetry or anything like that.
Yeah.
Poetry is even odder the way that comes. Usually every time I write a poem, I think I'm never going to write a poem again.
Yeah.
I'm done. There aren't any more in me.
Yeah. And then they just show up. I love it. Yeah. I love that too, because I feel like one of the things that the sort of the publishing industry does, and also sometimes MFA programs, is really like narrow track writers into like, this is what you're doing, you should write a novel, that's what you do. I love to see writers like moving around the place and doing whatever they want. Yeah.
Someone on Twitter the other day was had something about, I love messy books from geniuses, not genius work from geniuses, or something like that. And we do have this idea that everything has to be polished, neat, in the box that the previous work was in. And it's fun. It's one of the great things I think about small presses, is that they're willing to take a chance on that outlier.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. They have the flexibility is just a much higher degree. Okay, well now I went on a little tangent over there, and now I'm coming back. One of the stories, so y'all, if you read any story in this collection, I ask you please to find, get the book, open it and read. I mean, I want you to read all of it. But shadow boxing is this incredibly, it feels like a diamond, you know, like the pressure, how the diamonds are formed with the pressure of the coal, and it's dark and it's hard, but it creates something beautiful. That's what this story is. And I find it to be very central to the collection. It has this mix of hope and creation and darkness. And I wanted to find out from you, Matthew, what led you to write this story?
The central character in the story is an artist named Sarah. And Sarah used to be called Jana in the novel that I wrote for my MFA thesis. And I think she was called Jana in a story before that. And they were all completely different characters, but they were basically the same woman. And it was just a matter of finding the right venue or right vehicle for her. And so I've always been haunted by this young woman who's very into photography. And the image that I've always had is this image of her nailing Polaroids to the wall in her childhood bedroom. Because as I learned when I took Polaroids in third grade, thumbtacks aren't strong enough. So my teacher was very unhappy. I would bring Polaroids and she'd hurt her thumb trying to put them on the board. And so I've always remembered that, and that image has always stuck with me. And as I said, I've tried it 2 other times before now. And I think the same way that the pressure on the coal produces a diamond, I think just the pressure in my brain to finally figure this woman out was too much, and the story had to come out.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it's such a I love seeing mental illness and its messiness, and it's the way it affects people and the people around them, and all of that come out in a story. And that's something that definitely this story does. Is that an issue that you intended to sort of deal with in the story?
Yeah, absolutely. The reason that the story has the first person narrator, her older adopted sister, is because I wanted to show how over the years her younger sister's mental illness had kind of worn away at her, and she's really kind of a feisty, angry, edgy character as a result of just the ups and downs that she's gone through. So I didn't want it to be over the top or malicious or anything like that. I wanted to see the impact it's had on the family.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's very real in the story, and not it's none of it is neat or pretty, but it feels very real. And I would actually love to ask you to read a little bit from that story, because there's a section in it that I think speaks really to the collection as a whole. If you wouldn't mind reading those first paragraphs.
Absolutely.
For us.
Shadowboxing. I learned of my sister's death from the internet. Like so much of what was written about her, the post made up for a lack of facts with innuendo and attitude. Troubled painter Sarah Fry found dead earlier today. Unconfirmed reports imply she died at own hand. Might the art world's infant Tarib have saved her most Tarib for last? Regardless, it's the end of a once promising career. She was 35. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 weeks, which wasn't unusual, and I didn't hear from her husband, Ravi, for several more hours. She had killed herself, he told me when he finally bothered to call. She'd done it in her studio in Pennsylvania with a gun neither of us had known she possessed. When he finished, I began to thank him for finding time to call me himself, but he cut me off. Don't make this about you, Anita. You don't get to have some special claim on her. Not this time. But he was wrong. I'd been through too much with her for it to be otherwise. I remember when she got her first camera, a Polaroid. She took it everywhere, to school and to church, on Girl Scout outings and to the movies, where she'd sit up front and take photos of the unsuspecting audience, momentarily blinding them and getting herself banned from 2 Dallas multiplexes. She loved the shucking sound the machine made as it spat out each print, reveled in the brief moments before the image materialized. She often made a series of attempts, laying them side by side and scrutinizing the differences, the changes in the light and the way this affected the texture and color, how different angles made it possible to defamiliarize the familiar, highlight ordinary aspects of the unusual.
Yes, that's the part. The defamiliarizing the familiar is the part. I read that, and I was going straight through the correct collection as I read it, but I was like, immediately it rang for me, like that's what I'm feeling. That's what these stories are doing. They're defamiliarizing the familiar. They seem like ordinary people and situations, but there's something just a little off kilter about their orbit. I wonder if that's something that you actually were thinking about as you put this collection together. Were you tying these stories together with that as a theme, or something else?
When I started putting the collection together, I thought, well, I've got almost 20 years worth of published stories. This will be a greatest hits. And then I realized that was going to be unsatisfying. So I went through them very carefully, and I did look for thematic resonance and stories that would fit together in that way, because obviously they're not geographically linked or linked by a couple of characters or anything like that. So instead, I did look for things like that, stories that were a little unsettling, or stories that are defamiliarizing the familiar, or not really the opposite, but I have been trying lately to write some stories that familiarize the unfamiliar.
Ooh.
This will be the next book. We'll see.
I will look forward to that collection. Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the reasons I feel like this collection is actually so beautifully meant for this time, because we are in, we're in the COVID time, so we are in a very familiar, wearing our sweatpants and our nice tops and doing
Yeah.
Zoom calls and all of that. It's a strange time, as we know, and there's something familiar about, or comforting and familiar about these stories, because of that, and sort of nice thinking about having the same reaction in some ways, and it not being to the pandemic, being to other life events.
Right.
Could you have ever imagined that your that your collection would come out in a time like this in the world?
I spent a year worrying about the fact that it was going to come out 2 weeks before the election, and
Mm-hmm.
never conceived of the idea that it would come out during COVID, and that if it's not just competing with the election, but with all the books that were pushed back from spring, and it's hard enough to make noise when you have a small press short story collection to begin with, but it's certainly more challenging for both those more trivial reasons and also because of the seriousness of everything that's going on right now.
Absolutely. Let me move down. I have my notes, my question notes, also up on the screen, so I can make sure I make sense and don't wander off too much. So one of the other things I'm gonna ask you is about your time at the University of Minnesota and at the University of Mississippi, and you worked with some really powerful authors, including Barry Hannah, who I know was a big influence on you. Can you talk about working with those writers, especially Hannah, and how those relationships shaped your writing?
Yeah, I was very lucky. I worked with Barry Hannah at Mississippi. I worked with Charles Baxter and Patricia Hampel when I was at Minnesota. Hampel less so because she's more memoir, but I did take an essay writing class with her. And then I was also lucky the short time I was at Tennessee, I took a class with Richard Bausch when he was the visiting writer there. But Barry is certainly the one who stands out, and the one that people usually want to hear about, because he's, as one of my professors said, the madman of the South. It was tempered by the time I worked with him, but the best story I have is when I was finishing my thesis. He was on leave because unfortunately he had cancer, but he'd agreed to work with me even though he was on leave that semester. So most of our interactions happened over the phone, pre-Zoom days. And so
Yeah.
I called him. It was 5 days before my thesis was due. My bags were packed. My wife and I were going to Dallas to visit her family for Easter. And he said, 4 of these 5 stories need new endings. And I thought, oh, you gotta be kidding me. The clock is almost ticking out loud.
Yeah.
And finally, when I could pick myself back up off the floor, I said, well, do you have any advice for me? And he paused for a long time. I think I even heard him sigh. Maybe he was expelling cigarette smoke or something. And he said, endings are hard. And end of the conversation, which at the time I thought, oh, what am I going to do with that? But I ended up writing an essay about it about a year and a half ago, that it was actually good advice, because he kind of taught me that I needed to figure it out on my own, and that the idea of the sage on the stage wasn't going to work in this case.
Right.
I needed to try out some different strategies of my own. It didn't help at the time when I
Right.
new ending every day for 4.5 days, but survived.
Yeah. A lot of coffee, maybe some energy drinks.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. A lot of that. Charles Baxter at Minnesota taught me how to read, I would say. The level of attention he puts into reading and just noticing details was phenomenal. And so his class was really important for that reason. I had wanted to go to the University of Michigan when he was at Michigan, And I ended up at Minnesota, and lo and behold, a year after I get to Minnesota, he moves from Michigan to Minnesota. So I was very lucky. Yes.
Yeah.
But also, one thing I've learned over the years is that it's often not the famous professors who you get the most from. Beyond Barry, Steve Polanski, who I studied with at Minnesota, who's not a name that most people are going to recognize, taught me so much in the 2 classes I took with him about style and structure and dialogue in particular. And so what I always tell students when they're interested in going to graduate school is don't always assume that the biggest names are going to be the best teachers.
Yeah, that's true. I would agree with that as someone who has gotten my MFA as well, and it's amazing what people have to offer. Yes, I love that. Well, I'm hearkening back to sort of the idea of the madman of the South. The title story, Dunbar's Folly, is it's incredible. It's this wonderful sort of madman story himself. I mean, he has this sense of like reaching out for a dream or a hope he almost doesn't dare to have. He's coming to the end of his, seemingly of his academic career, and he's just kind of like reaching, and so he's going to build this Folly of Hastings, which is just incredible, and it's so timely. Also, I think for the times that we're in. What brought that story to life, and what does it mean for you, that title story?
That's a story that actually started with setting. So that's the outlier, I guess. I lived in Water Valley, Mississippi, about half an hour or so from Oxford, Mississippi, where we were in graduate school. And we lived in this little house on an organic goat farm. And the land around there always stuck with me, and I always wanted to do something with it. We used to walk around a lot. The goats would come up to the window and stick their noses up against the glass and climb on the car and all kinds of stuff. And so that land ended up becoming George Dunbar's home.
Nice.
I wanted something to go along with it, and I thought, well, how do I take advantage of having all of this wide open space? And for some reason, the idea of building a Folly came to me, and I thought, well, who's going to be crazy enough to do that? And I thought, a history professor, why not?
But of course. Yeah, I love it. And I mean, I think it's, it also speaks to the way that academia works. I mean, there's also, it's like sort of like Hollywood or modeling. There's you come to a point and everybody's like, well, whether you want to be done or not, we think you're done.
And that's what happens to George at the very beginning of the story. He's 64. His university is going through economic troubles. I wrote this story 10 years ago, so it's sad to think that it's still in a way, but his university is going through financial problems. And so they say, you know what? You're on the older end of our faculty. You're sucking up resources. And we're going to offer you a little severance if you go away. And so he has to fill the hours with something.
Yeah. And what a something. I love it. I'd love for you too to read a little bit of Dunbar's Folly. This is the last segment I'll ask you to read, and then I think we can also open it up to questions from the audience after that. So if anybody has a question, put it in the comments for us in the chat. But yeah, if you'll read the section.
So Dunbar has built most of the Folly at this point. The interesting thing, of course, about a Folly is that it's purposefully unfinished. So even though he's close to being finished, it's still not going to look perfect. From the top of the second story, nearly complete, he looked out on what he'd done, not just recently, but over the 35 years he'd lived there. He'd been unable to afford anything larger than a quarter acre in the university town, so he convinced his first wife to move out into the country, where they'd have privacy and all the space necessary for the brood of children they'd planned on having. But to his wife, privacy had felt like isolation, and the brood of happy, outdoorsy children they'd planned on stopped with Andy on account of a difficult delivery. No matter how Dunbar had shaped the land, he'd been unable to make Colleen see that living there wasn't so bad. Finally, when Andy was 4, she'd moved him back into town to a condo she paid for with her job as a copy editor for university publications. She'd never forgiven him for taking her away from her family and her beloved Ithaca. Alone, he'd funneled even more of his energies into the property. He'd had the pond cleaned and stocked, added groundsel bushes with their billowy white flowers and penchant for attracting butterflies all around the perimeter, and made sure the gallberry holly, white oaks, and tulip trees all stayed trimmed. He composted and studied natural remedies for the various pests and climate challenges of the Deep South. Later, he built the pier overlooking the pond so that it could hold more people, then began inviting colleagues to his house when he discovered that he didn't have enough friends to fill the new space. He'd wooed Megan with lavish meals served on that pier by candlelight, the flames dancing up and down the bodies of the water nymphs in the pond. Balanced carefully on top of the Folly, he realized that his work was nearly complete, that he had almost nothing left to do. Wind blew through the oaks, and he let himself sway back and forth with the breeze, even though giving up control frightened him. He waited until the rustling in the trees had died away to climb back down to the ground.
Thank you. I love that section because I feel like it encapsulates what he's going through, and it's such a beautiful use of setting and landscape.
Yeah, thank you. I was particularly interested in this character because once I realized he was building a Folly, I thought, well, whose goal is it to make something that can never be completed? And so I thought it was one of the more peculiar things about Professor Dunbar is that he is willing to dedicate so much time and resources to this project that is always going to look incomplete to people outside of his family.
Yes. And then of course there's the great like duality of the word folly and how it's like and I actually didn't know about a folly as a construction, and so I learned that from your story. Thank you.
You are welcome.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to some of the questions from Malaprops. We have a question about how has the COVID reality affected your writing process? Has it had an impact for you?
Absolutely. My wife and I teach college, and we teach 4th grade because our daughter is on Zoom or actually doing her schoolwork. So it has made a big difference in terms of just the time commitment. So also just, it took me a long time to be able to write anything because everything was so uncertain. I didn't really start writing until May. Again, I went on a residency for a week in Maryland, and I wrote a ton while I was there, and that kind of got things going again. But throughout the spring, there wasn't much happening.
Oh yeah, I know that is true for so many people, reading and writing and all the things. Okay, and then from I'm gonna go with this pronunciation and yell at me if it's wrong afterwards. Ilari Pass. Oh, thanks. Great. I saw the thumbs up. Yay. A couple of questions. First, you mentioned that you were taught to read. Is more than just looking for details, characters, etc.
Yeah, what I meant was that Charles Baxter taught me how to read as a writer and how to notice the details and the way stories are put together. I think even with an MA in English at that point, I was still either analyzing things from a literary perspective or reading just for plot and not really understanding the way the choices the writer makes impact the reader's experience.
Excellent. And then the second question, is it still a struggle for you to come up with a good ending?
Yes. Yes, it is. Good Intentions, as I mentioned, had a different ending. Bachelors as well. Interestingly, those stories went in opposite directions. Good Intentions became shorter. Bachelors, which is the earliest story I wrote that's in the collection, became several pages, I think 2 scenes longer than it had been. So I'm still working on learning how to end my stories.
It's a tough one. And Ilari says, thank you, also at the end of her questions. From Jennifer Buckner, a question: details in your writing, excerpts read tonight, and your novel and poems are so rich, they linger with me long after I close the books. I'm wondering if you have moments as a writer when you recognize rich sensory moments in life that you want to save for later. What do these moments feel like? How do you archive them until they find a place later in a piece of writing?
Wow. All right. I would say they aren't necessarily the ones that I notice at the time. A lot of times I'll have an experience, an encounter, and I'll think I'm going to file that away and I am going to use it later. But more often, it's really when I'm sitting down at the desk a month, a year, 10 years later, that something comes back to me and I remember, oh, that was that experience, and here I can use it in this place. So I try not to overthink those types of experiences any longer, because I've realized to trust my memory to recall various sensory details, I guess, when I need them.
That's excellent. We have another, Jennifer says, fascinating. What an incredible memory. Thank you. And then another question from Malaprops. Were there any stories that you planned to include in Dunbar's Folly but didn't? Any particularly tough choices there?
Yes, there was one story that I was going to include that I took out for more personal reasons rather than quality. It's just not a story I was ready to share with the world yet. So it's one I know, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Ellen Glasgow, who wrote a book called something like Stories I'm Old Enough to Tell. And she waited until most of her family was gone to tell this certain story. And so it's not as salacious as that, but it's a story that I'm going to hold on to. It's been written. I've actually sent it out recently, but it's not something that I was ready to put in the collection just yet.
Excellent. Those are always intriguing, intriguing things to hear. Do you have a preference for what you write? Do you enjoy writing a novel or a story or a poem or a piece of criticism more than the others?
I would say lately I've gotten more comfortable with the novel form. It's what I've worked in more recently. For a long time, a lot of my friends thought I was crazy because I found short stories easier than novels, because they would say, but in a story, you make one mistake and the whole thing falls apart. And I would say, sure, but then you're out a month's work. You're not out several years.
Right.
And now that I wrote my first novel, and now I'm working on what I hope will be my second novel, that's kind of the kind of pacing and rhythms of both the writing itself and the plot seems to be working well.
That's great. We have another audience question here from Sarah Good. I especially love the names of your characters that I've heard so far. What is your process for choosing names? Do you change the names often?
Okay. Hi, Sarah.
Mm.
Um, Names are really hard, actually. I think about them a lot. Um, I can't say for certain where they come from, but oftentimes there's just something about the sound of a name that sticks with me. I can't remember, for instance, where I came up with George Dunbar, but I knew from the very beginning that I'd refer to him as Dunbar throughout the story and not by his first name. He just seemed like that kind of character. But I rarely borrow names from real life or anything like that. I usually just work through kind of coming up with something. There's a story in the collection, The Soprano at Midlife, where the two sisters in the story, their mother's a Shakespearean scholar, so they're named after characters in As You Like It, for instance. But for the most part, it's just kind of a process of thinking and thinking. And I do usually come up with a placeholder name at the beginning, and that might be a more common name or something that I've heard more regularly, and then find and replace helps me out once I hit on the right name.
Yes. Bless, find, and replace. Whoever
Yeah.
came up with that should have some kind of Pulitzer Prize or Nobel Peace Prize or something.
Honorary.
Yes, exactly. Um, uh, on that subject, I wanted to ask you a little bit about something that just slipped out of my mind out one ear. Uh, what was it? Darn it. Anyway, it'll come back to me in a moment. Does anybody else have any additional questions as we come towards the end? Ooh, from Malaprops. Besides your own books, do you have any recommendations?
Absolutely. I am loving, but it's a bittersweet love, Randall Keenan's story collection right now.
Right.
So good. It is so unusual. I think he makes great intuitive leaps in the stories. He goes in directions that I was never expecting. He's got a story where Billy Idol is a character. I mean, how can you not like that?
Awesome. Yeah.
So that's my fiction recommendation right now. I've been reading a lot of creative nonfiction, a lot of essays, because that's what I'll be teaching next semester. And in particular, I loved Ross Gay's the book of, oh my gosh, what's it called? The book of,
See, it happened to you too. You're making
I
me feel
know, it's
better.
not the book of praise, but it's something, a book of joy, something like that. I can't remember, but they're really short essays from a great poet. And they're all about kind of celebrating the good things that happen in life. He wrote them almost one a day for a year, from birthday to birthday, and
Wow,
really a great book. I would recommend that too. I
that's
would
great.
the full title.
The Book of Delights, somebody
Yeah,
asked.
the lights. That's it.
Great.
If I had two wings, yeah, that's the Randall Keenan. I'm
Yes.
struggling with titles, but yeah, that Randall Keenan book is blowing me away.
Yeah. Yeah, if you all don't know, Randall Keenan just recently passed away, North Carolina author, beloved by many. Um, and yeah, the book of, which one is it? Oh, If I Had Two Wings. If Had Two Wings was his last book that we know of, and unless there's going to be a posthumous something. Um, Yes. And then are there any, you're teaching a lot of young writers. I'm sure you're sort of paying attention to what's going on out there. Is there anybody like new or up and coming that you're particularly excited about their work?
Um,
Like
my
I'm kind of putting you
wonderful.
on a spotlight.
Yes, they're not publishing yet, but they will soon, I'm sure. But I teach undergrads, so we're just kind of on the cusp of talking about publication. But I
Yes.
know that Sarah, who asked a question earlier, we need to keep her name in mind because she's going to have some good stuff coming out in the future. And Alari has been blazing through the poetry world of late.
Awesome.
See her publications on Twitter all the time. So I'm excited to see that too.
That's wonderful. I love it. Um, great. Well, any other questions from anybody? Um, uh, while you think on it, I will just remind you, of course, that Malaprops is our hosting bookstore here. I am incredibly biased because I worked there for almost a decade, but they are one of the best independent bookstores in the country, and we're very lucky to have them in North Carolina, and I live in Asheville, so I feel incredibly lucky to have them here. And so if you can support them this evening, please, purchase Matthew's books. I happen to know they have some signed book plates. So if you'd like a signed copy of the book, that is something that they can offer you. Think about them as you are doing your early Christmas shopping this year too. I have one more question before we pop off, and you'll see in the chat there are links to the books that Matthew has mentioned, and also to his book, both of his books actually, Dunbar's Folly and Swapping Purples for Yellows, which is his novel that came out last year. So Joanne O'Sullivan, who's one of my fabulous cohorts at Gold Leaf, yay Joanne, is here, and she asks, how do you know when a story is done?
Oh, I was hoping to sneak out of here with that question.
I had it on my list, but I didn't ask it of you.
Usually I get over anxious with my stories and I send them out before they're ready. And a round of rejections comes in from journals. And I say, okay, I'll look at it again. It's been 6 months. And so it's really that letting it sit for a little bit like that, and then going back with fresh eyes. I usually catch one more round of things, but really when it comes down to the fact that I'm taking the word that out, and then in the next draft I'm putting the word that back in, then I know I'm just kind of rearranging chairs at that point and it's ready. But I wish I had a better answer, but it just tends to be really intuitive at this point when it's ready. I have a wonderful first reader in my wife, who's always giving me feedback as well. And she's also really good at knowing when something's finished and ready to go. Or abandoned, as they say, right? It's never
right.
finished.
Right, exactly. There's a wonderful story about that I read about Alice Munro. One of the stories that she had written, she submitted to the New Yorker, and they were like, it's great, but we really think it needs to be in the other point of view. It was in third and they wanted it in first, or vice versa. She was like, okay, fine, and she redid the story around that and submitted it, and they published it. And then when she published a collection that included that story later, she put it back. She was like, this is the way I actually wanted it to be. Still never done, even if you're Alice Munro. So
right for her. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank all of you who are here this evening for coming. And Matthew, I want to thank you so much for being here, for sharing your work with us. And congratulations again on Duffus Folly.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Malaprops as well for having me. I look forward to being in the store again someday soon, hopefully browsing. I miss browsing.
Me too. Yeah. I recently said like someday we'll be able to like go into bookstores and lick we'll just have to lick everything because we'll be so excited to be in there. We won't actually do that though. That was a joke. I promise, Stephanie. All right. Well, again, thanks everybody. And please have a wonderful night. Please support your indie bookstores. Good luck getting through all of the months ahead that we have many things going on in the world. And thank you for your attention and your time.